Hey horror fans, bored now, Rachel Macdonald back with you, and this is a special video because for the first time we're doing a top 10 list. Now this is something we've spoken about. We decided it'd be a fun thing to mix things up. We're planning on doing a number of top 10 lists, not just for movies but also for TV. Obviously it makes sense to do horror themed top 10 lists and to start off with a horror themed one since it is October. So top 10 villains is what we're starting off with, particularly horror, but one or two entries might blur the lines a little bit. Me and Rachel have both come up with a list starting with number 10, so we're going to go 10 to 1 because that's the way a list should work, I think. And we're going to go back and forth. It'll be interesting to see because there will definitely, with a list like this, I think we're guaranteed some crossover, but I think some different choices should pop up as well. And it's a fun thing because you at home listening to this can also choose your own top 10 list and also suggest other lists that we can do. I'll check the comments. But this is top 10 villains, particularly horror villains. Before we start, Rachel, are there any honourable mentions that just missed out on you? I mean, I don't know if you want to mention them because it gives away maybe, but if there are...
I will mention one villain that I wanted to put on this list, but I didn't because the movie doesn't fall into horror and it doesn't really even fall into horror thriller. But I would like to give a special mention to Amy Dunn from Gone Girl, who is one of my favourite villains of all time because she is just brilliant. But Gone Girl is, of course, a psychological drama, so it doesn't really fall into the horror category. But I do want to mention that if I could put her on this list, I would, because she is cold, she is calculated, she knows exactly what she wants, and she wins, which is absolutely amazing. Like the end of the movie,
a knockout,
exactly. So I would give an honourable mention to Amy Dunn. What about yourself?
That's a nice shout. She's fantastic, and I will say, what's the actress name? It's gone out.
Rosamund Pike. She's brilliant.
She should have won the Oscar that year.
She really should have.
It's fantastic, and that's a film we should review. Yeah, there's quite a few honourable mentions. I think what was tricky because I was looking online at like lists like this, and I saw like a top 40 list, and the thing is, like his list, I think he was including a lot of like sort of like creatures and sort of spirits, and I think that's a bit murky when you start going down that. I think just because he wanted a top 40 list, so obviously ones you could consider, like he had, for example, the xenomorph from Alien, and I can understand that popping up on the list, but I think sometimes when you're talking about killers and villains, you maybe tend to stick to ones that are closer to maybe being human, or at least having some humanistic sort of traits. I mean, one I considered, which again is arguably a different genre, the Joker, I think, just...
Of course.
One of the greatest villains ever when he's at his best. And there's so many different versions of the Joker. And it's a character that's really moved with the times. And there's a lot of different... I think the way you see him in The Dark Knight, it's almost like this idea of the Joker as like a terrorist almost sort of thing. And obviously, depending on the version of the Joker you're getting, I think... he sort of fits the mold as a very like cerebral, sadistic killer, but also in certain portrayals of Batman, it definitely goes into horror, sort of gothic horror. I guess if you think of like the video game, for example, set in the asylum, that sort of goes into very horror-esque stuff. Ultimately weighed against it because it's not strictly from the horror genre, but I think in many ways he embodies a lot of the characteristics of a classic sort of horror villain. So
definitely.
So there's a few, and I just wasn't quite comfortable with including things like creatures or beings or stuff like that. I just think it's a different sort of thing. Because I think with something like the xenomorph, there's this argument then creature, then ultimately in a way it's just doing what is coming natural. And I think if you get into that sort of territory, it's quite hard to distinguish which monster is like more sort of devastating in some
Yes, of course.
I think with a lot of these, you're talking about being sadistic on a human level, like
Yes.
characters that are like almost the worst of what a human is, but still being connected to being a creature in some ways. Okay, I'm going to let you go first. So if you do your number 10, then I'll do mine.
So coming in at number 10 for me is the Dream Master himself, Freddy Krueger. Now, I love Freddy. A Nightmare on Elm Street is a classic slasher film, and Freddy is such a great villain. The first movie in particular, when Robert Englund is new to the role and he's giving it his all, he is terrifying. He is just so imposing. And I always loved the concept of Freddy, the fact that he comes for you in your dreams, because the fact of the matter is, at a certain point in time, you have to sleep. So there really is no escape from him. And I find that so terrifying and so effective. His design is brilliant. His backstory is brilliant. From the mind of Wes Craven, he's just so much fun. Now, the reason he's number 10 and not higher on this list is because the later movies do, unfortunately, dilute him a little bit. Obviously, Robert Englund starts to become a bit more comedic. He starts to become a bit cheesier, a little bit hammier, which does lessen the threat of him a bit. You have movies like Freddy's Nightmare or Freddy vs. Jason, which I actually do have quite a soft spot for, but, you know, he becomes very diluted as a villain, which is why he ranks number 10 as opposed to higher. But the original movie, the original concept, the perfect casting of Robert Englund, 100%, that's why he makes the top 10. So number 10 for me, Freddy Krueger.
A good way to start your list. And it's worth saying that England actually comes from a stage background originally, which not everyone might know, but I think that's why he does bring such weight, such sort of gravitas to the role. Iconic, and you can't really imagine anyone else but England in the role, so that says something. Well, you're going to hate me for my number 10. My number 10 is a horror icon like none other from right here in the UK. I've gone with the Leprechaun.
Oh my goodness! Oh, wow!
You didn't see that coming.
I did not see that coming at all.
The little fella just sneaked in under the wire. He was almost cut. And we're doing those movies, by the way. But he's such a fun-loving little guy. He finds so many different ways to kill people, to mess with their lives. He does magic. He seduces them. He sweet talks them. He plays them off against each other. He appeals to their sense of ego, to their sense of morality. He even had a space adventure where he went into space, which he did the perfect pastiche of 2001 A Space Odyssey. There's a lot of good cheesy funs, but the little fella is just so lovable and iconic, and he just finds so many ways to bring entertainment to the masses. Most of the films, it's played by Warwick Davis, who obviously people know from Willow, from Star Wars, and he proudly to this day will bring up the Leprechaun movies because in the UK he hosts a quiz show, and on one episode when you had like a horror fan on, he's like, you heard of a little known franchise called the Leprechaun movies, and he was proud to talk about them. So fair play to him, because obviously
that was a big surprise. I have to say, of everyone I thought might end up on like these lists, I've only seen the first Leprechaun movie, the one with Jennifer Aniston. So I might have to watch the rest of the franchise to see what you're seeing. But Warwick Davies, always good.
That series,
I have to say, I kind of love that your number 10 choice is so out of left field. That's very cool. That's a very cool way to kick off the list.
I love the pause as well when you like What did he say? Did he just say leprechaun? That was what I got from your expression there.
It was very surprising, I will admit, but I love it. That is great. So let's move on. Now, I'm going to be kind of predictable with number 9. I'm going with a very classic horror movie villain, Hannibal Lecter, because Hannibal Lecter is one of the first horror movie villains to genuinely scare the crap out of me. I saw Silence of the Lambs when I was a teenager, and Anthony Hopkins' performance, you can 100% see how he won Best Actor with only 24 minutes of screen time. He feels that movie. His chemistry with Jodie Foster is amazing. Every mannerism, every tick, every expression that he gives Lecter just adds to that overall terror. And not just terror, he somehow makes a character who is a cannibal completely charming. Like, you can understand why people might go to this guy as a shrink. You can understand how Clarice becomes so wrapped up in him, because Anthony Hopkins is just so good in that role. He adds so much atmosphere to every scene that he's in, and when he finally gets to do the violent stuff, it feels natural for the character. I love all his little improvs. Of course, the Chianti line, which everyone knows was an infamous improvisation of his. I just love everything about him. And of course, the way he's filmed with so many of those straight on shots, so it looks like he's staring into your soul, which you really don't want from Hannibal the Cannibal. Like, he should not be looking at you like that. It's fantastic. Again, he ranks lower on this list because I do feel that the sequel does dilute him a little bit. Hannibal, he's not quite as threatening in Hannibal, at least not for me. Same with Red Dragon with Ed Norton. I just do not find him as threatening. But the first movie, he is fantastic. And I just love him so much. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to have Hannibal Lecter in your top 10, but I think it's also, there's a reason why he makes the top 10 list so often, because he is just that iconic. So he's my number 9.
I think he's worthy of being in the top 10. And it's also worth saying about the original Hannibal film, which is Manhunter, which is actually...
with Brian Cox.
Who's absolutely brilliant in a different way, a different sort of Hannibal. And actually, as a choice, although I would say Silence of the Lambs is the better movie, I actually prefer the Hannibal we get in Manhunter as a choice. Interesting. No, obviously Hopkins did a great job as a different sort, and it's the one obviously everybody remembers. And I hear good things about the TV show. Actually, I've not. I
do too.
Show, so that's something I want to check out at some point. So that's your number 9. My number 9, going for another classic here, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. One of the most disturbing, most animalistic horror villains ever. Just very unpredictable, and the performance in those original movies, particularly the first one from Gunnar Hansen, is just terrifying. I think he's this force of nature. I really like the physicality of his performance and just how unpredictable it is, and how everything he does in that film just feels really authentic. It doesn't feel like a film in a way where it's been edited and you get different scenes, because that's obviously the appeal of that first film, just how organic it feels and how it flows throughout, where it appears as though there's very little edits in it. And he is absolutely terrifying in that role. I've heard, he's obviously no longer with us, but I hear as a guy he was a really nice guy, and that happens so often. People who play these monsters actually turn out to be the nicest guys you can meet. But so the fact that he could go to those dark, sort of sinister places, and I think certainly for some of the sequels it holds up, although the quality is up and down in the sequels. I think certainly in the second movie, I think he's sort of every bit as terrifying, at least in his performance. I mean, you can argue what they do with the character, but truly iconic. One of the most terrifying villains I've ever seen in a movie. And again, I think with that, and you've got the whole family, which is something which appeals about that first movie. It's like a whole family of these creepy little characters. But Certainly, if you took Leatherface out, I don't think the film would be quite the same.
Definitely solid choice. Leatherface. I've only seen a Texas Chainsaw Massacre once, and that was honestly enough for me because Leatherface scared me so badly. That final shot of him on the highway where he's just swinging the chainsaw around, like, just haunted my dreams. So definitely a solid choice. I agree. He's a great villain. I actually haven't seen any of the sequels. I've only seen the original and then the remake. So that's all I really have to go off. But I imagine that, if he's still got the same kind of like physique and physicality to him, definitely would be terrifying, because I agree with you about that kind of raw animalistic nature that he has, where he's almost not even a human, and he is just, Gunnar Hansen he's brilliant. Like, his performance as Leatherface is one of the most iconic performances and is just so great the way he sells that character. And it's so easily a character that in the hands of a wrong actor could come across as very cheesy and very over the top, but he doesn't do that. Like you said, the movie is done in such a realistic style that he just comes across as absolutely terrifying. So yeah, I'm on board with that. So my number 8 might be a bit of a surprise, because this is not a full-on villain. This is a character who descends into villainry, and that is Nancy Downs from The Craft, played by the wonderful Fairuza Balk. Now,
she's great, isn't she?
Yeah, she is great. The Craft is one of my favorite horror movies. Like, I love anything from the 90s, and The Craft is such a great snapshot of the 90s. Like, you really couldn't imagine it existing elsewhere. I know they tried to do a reboot. We're not going to talk about that. But Nancy Downs is such a great character. First of all, you have Fairuza Balk, who is just brilliantly cast as Nancy. All the girls are outcast to some extent. Nancy is trailer park trash and feels that very strongly, and obviously wants to use the witchcraft to take over that. And I love seeing her slow descent into villainry, her jealousy over Sarah's power, her pursuit of taking in the spirit. And when she finally does and she tips over the edge and goes completely batshit crazy, it's so much fun to watch Fairuza Balk just kind of play the slow unraveling of the character till you get to the end where she's screaming and stabbing Nancy, and she is goddamn terrifying. Because she's just lost her marbles by then. And then, of course, you see the very almost sad kind of end to her character, where she does end up in a mental asylum because she's so far gone from the power that she's taken into herself and gotten drunk off that I just think that she's such a compelling, fun character. I also think because she has a descent into villainry, she has a few more layers than so far the ones that we've talked about on this list. She's an actual, like, real character who has a character arc, who has a clear path. And I really like, every time I watch The Craft, I just enjoy the hell out of her performance and watching her slide into insanity over the course of the movie. And so she just is just a great character and great villain for me. So that's my number 8, good old Nancy Downs from The Craft.
Yeah, good choice, good shout. I think, like you, I have nostalgia for that movie. I did grow up. I haven't watched it recently, so I can't really comment on what I feel about it, how well it holds up. But it's certainly a very watchable film, and you've got solid characters anyway. But I would say her character is maybe the standout, and I think a lot of that comes through her performance. I think she just brings this sort of X factor, this sort of different sort of like presence. You could argue than the other characters maybe outside of her are a bit too normal, and you almost need that more
that crazier presence. She's just got so many great scenes, like when she pretends to be Sarah and she pushes Chris out the window, or like I said, her end scene with Sarah where she's going completely nuts. Even the scene where she takes in the spirit when they do the ritual on the beach, just everything about it. Fairuza Balk just carries that character so well. She's been one of my favorite characters and villains for so long, so I just absolutely love Nancy.
My number 8 is, and I think we're returning to the theme of kind of childlike things that are just like creepy and terrifying. So I've gone with Pennywise from It. Nice. You can sort of take your pick. I mean, obviously most people have a preference for the Tim Curry Pennywise, and I think he really made the role his own. I think he just gets the mannerisms down so well, and the sadistic sort of laugh, and just how malevolent that character is. Obviously the original, well, both versions really, but because the story in general is just a coming of age style story and you're looking from the perspective of these much younger characters, I think you see how terrifying the presence of Pennywise is. And I actually don't mind the new Pennywise too much. I probably have a preference that the first It movie is better than the miniseries, because when I went back and watched the miniseries, I think it now seems a bit dated and doesn't hold up so well. But it's obviously worth seeing just for Tim Curry. He's so good as Pennywise, and I'm just someone who's sold on clowns being creepy in general. I've never really found clowns that appealing or that charming or likable. I just see them. It's a grown man, probably middle-aged, with hair and makeup and all this stuff, and doing these wacky things, approaching kids, and I just think creepy. So anytime you can turn that into like a horror villain, I'm on board with that. Another example is like, as someone who follows wrestling, there was a character, like a wrestler, that like who was a clown. It worked when they made him into what they call a heel in wrestling, so a villain, because again, it's like clowns are creepy. So when he was actually a bad guy, it actually worked. But when they tried to make him just a happy-go-lucky clown, it didn't work so well. Pennywise is my number 8.
Pennywise is a great villain, and I'm with you. Clowns are terrifying. I don't know why we try to convince children that they're fun and friendly. It's like, no, kids, just watch It. That's what clowns are like. Clowns are no good. So definitely solid choice. Pennywise, I'm with you. He's terrifying. No good.
And just some of the way he uses magic and the psychology of what he actually does to the kid. I mean, for anyone who knows the story of it, it goes to some really dark places.
Definitely all about childhood trauma, and he's a very good representation of that. So yes, solid choice for number 8. So I guess we'll go to my number 7. This is another one that, again, might be a bit of a surprise because it's a female villain. She's not an obvious villain, but I'm going with Lucille Sharp from Crimson Peak. Which is a great gothic horror by Guillermo del Toro, whose name I can never pronounce. Lucille is played by the wonderful Jessica Chastain, who is just amazing. I love her. And for anyone not in the know, Crimson Peak is the story of a young girl who was brought to a house by her new husband, and it turns out his sister, Lucille Sharp, is extremely malevolent. She and her husband, spoilers here, people, if you haven't seen it, but they basically bring young women into their house. The brother marries them and then they kill her. She is also carrying on an incestuous relationship with her brother, played by Tom Hiddleston. The reason I love Lucille so much is, again, she's kind of a tragic villain. You find out that their mother and their father were physically abusive towards them. You find out that Lucille broke her leg when she was younger, and that was a result of like her father actually like becoming violent with her. She murdered her own mother, and that in the wake of their parents' deaths, she has become extremely obsessively codependent on her brother, and her whole life has been about protecting him. It's just that in order to protect him, she happens to murder women, which is maybe not the best way to protect your younger sibling, but each to their own. But I think that Lucille is an extremely tragic villain, and I think that her desperation to protect her brother, her obsessive love for her brother, which she talks about herself, she talks about it being a monstrous love, and the things that she does for this love, they are horrible, but they need to be done. She's very aware of what and who she is, that she's evil, that she's dark. She even likens herself to moths that like hide in the dark and are unattractive. And I think that Jessica Chastain plays her with enough tragedy that even as you want them to defeat her and take her down, you also feel so sorry for her for being put in these circumstances. And she has a very tragic end of dying and becoming a ghost in the house that is unable to leave, because she is just so linked to the house and to the tragedy of the house and to the violence and the horror that she's experienced, that is the only ending that she can have. So I just love the complexity and the tragedy that surrounds Lucille Sharp. And I also love female villains, so a well-written female villain is always a good thing in my books, and horror movies unfortunately don't have a lot of them. It's more males, so the fact that I could put her on this list is fantastic. So ever since I watched that movie for the first time, I have loved Lucille Sharp, and I love Jessica Chastain. I think she's a great actress, and I think she does great in the role. So Lucille Sharp comes in at my number 7.
You hit on a good point, because it's probably an area that horror movies have to do better in. There's at least a bunch of really good sort of protagonists in horror movies that are female, that are obviously sympathetic, but yeah, it is maybe harder to think of really good female villains. So it probably is something they need to improve on in the genre in general. We should do that one day, that film. That would be interesting.
We should.
Because I'm not so hot on it, I'll say that now. And I like Jessica Chastain a lot. I'm not sure it's the best use of her talents, but I may feel differently if I revisit the film. So my number 7, going for another icon here, another different sort of horror villain, and that is Pinhead from the Hellraiser movies.
Pinhead!
I think just the visual of him is one of the most iconic. I think the visual of him is wrapped up with all these sort of gothic, disturbing, dark imagery. I think another side to it is the fact that there's obviously an SMM sort of theme going on with him, and apparently that comes from the author Clive Barker. He had an interest in that stuff, apparently. And there's just something really twisted and inventive about actually working that into like a horror villain. And I sort of love how liberal that is, just saying, hey, this stuff is out there and I enjoy it. And I think it naturally lends itself to a villain and a horror sort of premise, where it's a fine line between torture and pleasure, and that's something which Pinhead plays on. I think really good performance. I love the look of him. I love the makeup and the whole sort of costume. And I think another thing that makes him a layered villain in a different sort of way is, certainly in the early movies, there is a sense of morality to Pinhead, because his victims tend to be these really douchey, nasty, sort of rich, sort of corporate types. And a lot of times it's almost like he's making them pay for their sins. And it's almost like if they didn't do bad things, he's not like the Michael Myers style villain who will just kill anyone who gets in his way. I think he does target particular people. So I think that adds an extra layer to him as a character and the kills. And he just comes up with really inventive, sadistic ways and a lot of psychology behind the way he plays characters off each other. And again, he's a very cerebral villain. I would say he's more cerebral and twisted than anything. There's loads of Hellraisers I haven't seen, but the original 2, at least, I think hold up pretty well.
Well, we might have to revisit them, because like I said, I haven't seen them in years, but I was not a fan of Hellraiser, so I would be interested now to rewatch and see if I feel differently, especially now that you've given me all of this to think about, because I never really thought about Pinhead as being like that complex of a villain. So that's definitely an interesting take, but I like that perspective. And I think if maybe we revisit the films, we could always talk about doing at least some of the franchise and see if I feel any differently. So that could definitely be one to visit down the track. All right, so coming in at number 6. Now, I have to say, this next one I was hesitant to put on this list. I really wanted to put her on this list, but in my mind, she's not really a villain. Like you, before I was doing this list, I went and did some research and I looked at top 40 lists and top 20 lists, and she is almost always on best villain lists. So I thought, hey, I might as well include her, and it is Carrie White. Now, Carrie is, of course, a classic horror film. One of the earliest horror films I ever watched. I love Carrie so much. Now, I would say the real villain in this film is her mother, because Mrs. White is just a nutbag, and her daughter probably would not have been as crazy if she hadn't repressed her so much. But But given that Carrie does go crazy and kills everyone at the end of the movie, I guess she can be counted as a villain. Now, Carrie, of course, has a very sympathetic arc. We see her being bullied. We see the trauma of her getting her first period. We see the trauma of her being an outsider with an overly religious mother who locks her in a cupboard and chants over her and waves crucifixes around. So she's very, very sympathetic. Sissy Spacek is, of course, fantastic in that role. She brings a real vulnerability to Carrie. You really feel for this poor girl who is going through all of this trauma. And of course, as everyone knows, they have the infamous plot to spill the pig's blood on her at prom. And I just find it so sad and so endearing to see how much fun she's actually having at prom. You know, her date is actually being a nice guy and she's having the time of her life. She's feeling attractive. She's feeling included. And then, of course, we have that iconic scene with the pig's blood. Carrie's rampage at the end of the prom is one of my favorite horror scenes ever because it is just so brilliantly filmed. Sissy Spacek, covered in blood with that wide-eyed, crazy look on her face, is chilling. I love seeing the carnage. I love seeing the panic of the students, and I love that slow walk she does through the crowds and out the front door as the place is on fire. It's just such a great build-up and payoff. When she's wrecking the gym, you just want to say, you go, girl. Like, yes, take your revenge on the town. Like I said, I feel that she's more victim than villain, but I guess given that she does, you know, go nuts at the end and kills everyone, I guess technically she would be a villain. And because so many other lists include her, I was like, yes, I will include her on this list because I've loved Carrie White since I first saw the movie. So Carrie White for my number 6.
Yeah, like you, I did see her on the list I look at, and I guess I wasn't quite convinced enough to add her, but I do love the character, great performance, and I think certainly up there for Stephen King adaptations, one of the very best, I think. And that prom scene and the whole thing, it's just gone down in pop culture. It's been reproduced in so many different things or reference, and we're now like 40 years on, something like that, 40, getting on for 50 years, I guess. So it does show you when something has sustained throughout the decades.
Yes.
So I can't argue with that. It's a great character, and I can understand why people might see her as a villain. So that's a good shout. Okay, my number 6, and it's the first time we've crossed over a pick than you've already had, so a bit higher for me, and that is Freddy Krueger. So
nice.
My number 6. I absolutely love Robert Englund in the role. I think certainly in the early movies he gets the right balance between being a very sneaky, sadistic, malevolent, like villain who's very sort of like just cerebral and twisted, but also having a presence, being terrifying, being unpredictable. It is one of the great hooks, like you said, this gimmick of he can only get you when you sleep, because everybody at some point has to go to sleep. And I think that just opens up so many possibilities in the storyline where you can play with it and do different things. It's a tremendous performance. He is so terrifying. There's some great kills that comes out of his character and what he can do. And I generally think for a good 4 or 5 movies, it's not until a bit later where it does become too pantomime-ish and it almost becomes like it's a stand-up comedian almost, and they just go too far. I think certainly for the first few movies, I think they get the right balance, because definitely in these horror movies there are room for entertaining lines. Obviously his "Welcome to Primetime, bitch" it is one of the greatest horror lines ever, when he just slams the TV down on her. That is a great one-liner, and it fits the character how he gets off on this stuff. But obviously a bit later on they went too far with the sort of goofy humour. The character holds up. He had a tremendous run, and if you're talking about comparison between Pinhead and Freddy, I think the performance of England probably elevates him above Pinhead a little bit. With Pinhead, a lot of the appeal is the look of the character. As I said, some of the ideas behind the character, but just as a physical performance and the way he delivers the lines, I think I can't see anybody else as Freddy.
I know, right? He's brilliant. It was one of those perfect marriages between actor and character that just worked out so well. And we ended up with this completely iconic horror movie villain that he will go down, for years. People will be talking about him. He is just so great. And Robert Englund was such a perfect pick. So I'm glad we got some crossover with Freddy. It's definitely a good one to have crossover with. So yeah, I think his later goofiness must bug me a little bit more than it bugs you, which is why he's obviously a bit higher on your list. But the fact that he made it to both of our lists, I think, is a good commentary on what a great villain he really is. Now, my number 5 choice. It's interesting that you were talking earlier about entities and creatures being on top 20 lists, because my next one is actually not a creature or a person. It's a house. Have you seen Stephen King's Rose Red, the miniseries? No. Okay, so Rose Red is very loosely kind of based off The Haunting of Hill House, except in this one, the house itself, Rose Red, is a sentient being, and Rose Red is my number 5 villain. Rose Red is a 3-part miniseries that was actually written by Stephen King after a failed adaptation of Hill House fell through with Steven Spielberg. Spielberg went off into a different project, and King took his original script and turned it into a new script about this house called Rose Red, which was built at the turn of the 20th century by an oil tycoon for his young bride, his very, very unhappy young bride, whose essence kind of ends up filling the house. And she's told by a psychic that the house will never be done until she says it's done. So the house continues to build and build and build. And over the years, people keep disappearing. And it turns out the house is pretty much eating them. So basically, this house is this malevolent being that will take you, and it especially likes people with psychic abilities. And this series focuses on a professor who studies paranormal activities, and she takes a group of psychically gifted people into the house to kind of wake it up and get proof that the paranormal exists. And one by one, of course, they start dropping. Now, the reason that Rose Red ends up on this list is because the way the miniseries is filmed and the architecture of the house and the sets that they built for this house are some of the creepiest haunted house stuff I've ever come across. And the fact that the house itself is alive, and you even hear it breathing at some point, you hear it whispering, you see it taking people, you see it manipulating people. We were talking in our most recent Hill House episode about how Hill House itself is sentient. It's got nothing on Rose Red. Rose Red is a malevolent, evil, horrible, awful mansion that wants to kill everyone in sight. And the miniseries is so effective at showing you how creepy this house is that it really does become a character in and of itself. So if you get a chance to see it, because it is brilliant. It's very good King stuff, very good haunted house stuff, lots of atmospheric building of tension. A lot of the kills are really good, and it's got a lot of really cool ghost stuff, but the house is so terrifying that it actually scares me. And so that's why it became my number 5 villain, because it's just that well written that you really believe that this house is so malevolent that it's going to get you. So that's my number 5.
Oh, that's a really good shout, a really different sort of choice, and again, something we could maybe review in the future, because obviously it's something that you feel strongly about. And this is the good thing about list, really. I mean, I think a lot of people wouldn't think to have that on their list, but it's obviously something that connects to you very strongly. So very interesting choice. So at number 5 for me, we have another crossover, because I've gone with Hannibal Lecter as my number 5. Apart from some of the things we've spoken about, you obviously have different takes on him throughout the years. Brian Cox is a very different take. It's a lot more toned down, a lot more sort of subdued, and a lot more kind of, in some ways, psychological. A lot more sort of understated, like posh British sort of take on the character. A different kind of Lecter, and then you have the more macabre version and a lot more theatrical version of Hopkins. I think another thing to add to what you said earlier is then it is one of the most influential characters of the modern era, because it changed the way things were done on not just film but also on TV, with the way you get characters in like these forensic style shows. It almost feels like Dr. Lecter was such a brilliant mind, and obviously he used it for really sadistic purposes, but his mindset and the ideas of him you can almost see manifest in like modern crime fiction on TV. And just the fact that the sort of scenes we see with him and Khalees, and the sort of scene we saw with the character and Will Graham in Manhunter, the sit-down interview where you are getting the idea is then the cop or the detective, the FBI guy is there to get information from Lecter. He becomes an expert, but unfortunately it's not going to be that simple. They have to play a cat and mouse game, and that's part of it. Lecter gets off on that, and that sort of interview style scene has been recreated so many times since. Obviously, it's a big feature of the series Mindhunter on Netflix. And recently, actually, because I saw the new Bond film, there's a similar scene to that in the new Bond with Blofeld and Bond at some point. And it just it's rippled through so many different things. So I think he's a very humanistic villain in some ways, because certainly in Silence of the Lambs, there is this sense of respect between him and Khalees, and there's a certain like father-daughter type thing, but obviously it does get very creepy, very sinister as well. But there is the respect there between the two characters, and I think on many levels you respect this guy as a brilliant thinker, and to some extent, because he is helping the protagonist, you are kind of on board with him. But at the same time, you then will get the moments that are so shocking and out of the blue, then it reminds you this guy is a monster. He's definitely one of the most distinct monsters and one of the most complex monsters I think we've seen in like modern storytelling, really. So
he's a brilliant character. He's so good, and just a lot of layers. And I like what you're saying about like you do end up respecting him, and you almost sometimes at times forget what he actually is. And then you have a scene like where he eats the guy's face off, and you're like, oh no, wait, that's right, he's a cannibal. We need to remember
Let's
that.
not forget that.
So I love having that crossover. Hannibal Lecter, that's a great choice. But we have some more crossover coming up, because my number 4 is one that you have already mentioned, and that is Pennywise the Dancing Clown, who is terrifying and has been terrifying since I was a child. So I first saw the original It when I was about 8, which I still don't remember how I saw it, because I'm fairly certain I was not allowed to watch those types of films when I was a kid, but I saw it, and I remember not going near a storm drain for like years afterwards. For me, Tim Curry will always be Pennywise, because he is brilliant, and I love that he brings kind of a dark humor to the role. So I find a lot when I'm rewatching the original It, which is actually one of my favorite horror movies. I know that it is quite dated and it can be quite cheesy, but for me it really captures the feel of the book and the innocence of the book, and then the terror of the children. And I feel that Tim Curry's performance, he gives this performance where you'll watch him and you'll almost be laughing at what he says, but then it's like you kind of pull yourself up and go, oh no, shouldn't laugh. He's not actually funny. Or he'll do something that will remind you that he's actually like a sadistic monster underneath. And I think that Tim Curry really gets that balance of, you can understand why kids might be appealed and might go near him, but then he reveals his true colors and he's just terrifying. I have to admit, I didn't mind Bill Skarsgård in the new movie. I actually don't like the new It. I didn't like it at all. I might have to revisit it because I haven't watched it since I saw it in the cinema. I own it because that's what I do, but I haven't rewatched it. And I wasn't a massive fan of it, but I did think that Bill Skarsgård really made Pennywise his own. You know, like he didn't try to emulate Tim Curry. He didn't try to
It's a different
imitate him in any
take.
way.
Yeah.
Yes, and I appreciated that, because I thought the last thing you want to do is come in and imitate a performance that is so iconic. So I didn't mind Bill Skarsgård, but for me, Pennywise will always be Tim Curry, and the terror will always come from Tim Curry's Pennywise. And he's just such a great villain. And after having read the book, with what you were saying about how you really feel the kids' terror, and I think that comes across so strongly in the book as well, and the 1990 miniseries, that even when you get older and Pennywise is maybe not scary to you anymore, you really feel the terror from these kids, the visions that he's sending them, the way that he pops up in their dreams, the way he pops up in the photo album, or just makes the pictures move, or makes the pictures start bleeding. You really feel these poor kids are so trapped in this nightmare that they can't seem to get out of. And Pennywise is such a presence in their lives, and the terror of him, of this inescapable monster that the adults can't see and that they can't get any help with. And so I think he's such an effective villain for children. And like I said, when I saw this as a kid, didn't go near a storm drain. So he's like scared the crap out of me as a child. And even though he doesn't really scare me as much now as an adult, because I think I've just gotten used to it because I rewatch the original movie so often, he's still such an effective villain. And Tim Curry is obviously just having so much fun playing the role and like just hamming it up. And I mean, Tim Curry is always good value, but I feel like he was really made to play Pennywise. Like, I don't think they could have gotten a more perfect piece of casting than Tim Curry as Pennywise. So it's a bit of crossover for you. Pennywise the Dancing Clown is my number 4.
Yeah, great choice. I think that and Franken Werther is probably his two most iconic roles. But yeah, he's brilliant. Love Tim Curry. Love him as that character. So I need to read the book. Actually, I've not read the book, but I'll definitely put it on my list to do. My number 4, which is the oldest character I've got on the list as far as how far he dates back, going for a little bit of European flavour here, a little bit of classic old school flavour, I've gone with Dracula.
Very
so
nice.
Again, a character where you've got the template which then can ripple through the years, so many different takes. Again, it's another more cerebral type villain, a more sort of sexy, seductive sort of villain. And obviously, as we've seen in so many like TV and films that feature, I mean, not just Dracula, but vampires in general, there's a lot of stuff you can do, a lot of like metaphors you can do to when it goes to like playing with light and dark, people being drawn towards their darker sides, their more animalistic sort of urges, which is something the character of Dracula plays on. And obviously just some of the early performances, like the Bela Lugosi performance in the Universal films, it's so great because he does so much with so little. He you know, it's all through his mannerisms, it's all through the tone of his voice. But he has that charisma, that presence. And I think when Dracula is done right, when you get a good Dracula, then you want that charisma, you want that sort of presence. Also, that idea then it could tip over into something a lot more unsettling at any point. There's something like unsettling about how seductive the character can be, and just how he plays with the audience and his prey. And obviously, it definitely, on another level, it appeals to the fun, campy side of horror as well. There's that side, and it's always enjoyable seeing the other sides of Dracula. You know, sometimes that they all really go for the more campy, the more silly, the more ridiculous. And you know, some versions work, some don't. But you obviously have them going into different genres with him. And I think a character that has sustained over many, many decades. And when you think of horror, I just think the character is one that, if you just ask people to say a villain or a creation of horror that springs to mind first of all, I think he would be one of the first. Yeah.
Dracula is a great choice. Gotta love Dracula. Love the original novel. I love the way it's told as if it's an actual account that has happened, through letters and journal entries. Bela Lugosi, of course, great. Also love Christopher Lee, his
Me
Dracula
too.
from the 70s.
Yeah.
And I have a real soft spot for Gary Oldman's Dracula just because I love Coppola's cheesy, intense 90s take on the character. So I know that Oldman isn't always people's favorite Dracula.
No, I do like him. Actually, I think there's an argument, and the film isn't great, but I think
The film's not fantastic,
I
and
think,
you've got Keanu Reeves.
I think Oldman as villains is always good, so I do.
Yes.
I can definitely get on board with him as Dracula. And I think it's a preference of mine when it comes to like these certain sort of creatures. When it comes to, you talk about werewolves, another horror staple. You talk about maybe zombies, but my go-to is more vampires. I just find them more interesting generally.
I agree.
And I think obviously modern sexuality is another thing that you can explore through vampires because they are very sexual characters. So.
Dracula almost made it onto my list. He lost out just barely, but I'm definitely on board with that. So, coming in at my number 3 is more of a modern horror classic villain, and that is Ghostface. And when I say Ghostface, I am kind of referring to Ghostface as an idea in general, but I am mostly referring to Billy and Stu because they are the OG Ghostfaces, and in my opinion, and for me, they are the best Ghostfaces. Scream is my favorite horror movie of all time. I love Scream. I love the postmodernism of it. I love the 90s-ness of it. I love Sidney Prescott as a character, and I love Ghostface. I love that he is a bit of a modern spin off the calls that are coming from inside the house. Obviously, phone calls in horror movies are not a new thing. We have Black Christmas, you have When a Stranger Calls. So I like that Scream is a little bit of a twist on that. So I like Ghostface that he uses the phone. He's one of the more brutal killers on my list. Like a lot of the villains I've listed so far are actually fairly milder villains. Ghostface is very intense. His kills are insane, especially in the first movie. Casey Becker and Steve Orff, the first 2 victims, have 2 of the bloodiest death scenes in the franchise. Casey's death scene is not Casey. Why did I say Casey? Tatum's death scene is fantastic, and I love Billy and Stu as Ghostface because they are just so dumb sometimes, and they're such teenagers that they basically end up being foiled because they're so stupid and because they just don't think things through. But I do also think there's a real malevolence to Ghostface in all of the iterations because he is this constant presence in Sydney's life. No matter what she does, and as we see in the new movie, she just can't seem to escape him. I think the mask was really fun. I think it was a great design, and it's obviously become so iconic, which is kind of funny because I'm pretty sure it was just a mask bought at like a local costume store that someone just picked up.
That's what I heard,
Yeah. And I think that the phone calls, are obviously so synonymous with Ghostface that they've become like a really fun part of his shtick, and I like the way they try to update them with all of the movies. The third movie's a little with the different voices, but overall, Ghostface for me is just such a fun killer, and the fact that he's become so iconic, even though it's more of a recent villain, I think speaks volumes as to how effective Ghostface is as a villain. So he gets my number 3 spot.
That's fair enough. I can't argue too much with that. I enjoy him as a killer. Obviously, it's a bit like you said, it's a bit murky because different people tend to play him. For me, probably there's things that stand out more than him in the Scream movies. So he's a good villain. But I mean, that sort of leads in quite nicely to my number 3 because my number 3 is also a more modern villain and a very 90s again, at least in the original film, and that is the sex icon Tony Todd as Candyman.
Nice.
We both agree how sexy he is as well as how menacing he is. So Candyman, a tremendous, complex villain with a tremendous history, a great backstory, one of the most sympathetic horror villains you'll ever see because of his plight, because of his history. Certainly the original Candyman and also the recent Candyman does a great job of using his sort of heritage to comment on racism and modern themes. And a really layered villain, tremendous, like, iconic, engaging performance from Tony Todd. He's so commanding in the role originally, and I like the guy they got as the new Candyman this year. I thought he had a lot of personality, a lot of presence, and I think obviously at this point we probably are talking mostly about the original because the new one has only just come out. But
Yeah.
I think the original horror movie Candyman, it's a great concept. It's absolutely scary and atmospheric, a lot of style. He's a very unpredictable villain. Again, there's just this great hook because it's set off this trend of, you know, saying his name a certain amount of times in front of the mirror. And that's another concept you can just play with because it almost this bravado of, because they don't believe that he's real, then they're just going to casually say the name 3 times, and it almost plays on that sort of idea of, you don't believe in me, well, you're going to pay now because you underestimated me. You didn't sort of see me. And again, that plays into some of the racial themes as well, I think. Iconic, terrifying, complex. I think as Todd plays him, there's so much humanity that goes into the part. And it's a really great story in that opening movie. It really opens your mind to a lot of different themes. I think just as a pure performance that is just so well done throughout the film, then I think Tony Todd is up there. His performance as Candyman is one of the best performances in a horror movie. And I think the character will stand the test of time.
Yep, I agree. Well, I'm actually going to. It's funny that he's your number 3 because I'm going to segue into my number 2, who is Candyman. Candyman is number 2 on my list, which I don't think anyone's really surprised by. I don't really have much to add to what you've said, except to say that Tony Todd is amazing and seductive and terrifying all at the same time. I totally agree that he has such a great backstory, the tragedy of his backstory, and the way they use that to talk about racial issues in the present. Obviously not as much in the original film as in the new film, but they definitely touch on it in the original film. I love the gothic horrorness of the original film. You know, it's almost like a gothic love story because he comes back because Virginia Madsen's character reminds him of his love, who he was executed for, and he wants to be with her, and it's almost a romantic thing. Like when he's saying be my victim, it's supposed to be said in like a romantic, seductive tone, and you know, I hear it and I'm instantly like, yes please, I'll be your victim, Candyman, come take me. He's a great character, but it's another one of those perfect marriages of character and actor. The fact that they wanted Eddie Murphy for the role just is, I don't even
hilarious.
know. Yeah, I know, right? So thank God they did not go with that, because Tony Todd, with his incredibly tall presence and his incredibly booming, seductive voice, is just perfect. And Candyman is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I like the play on urban legends. Of course, like you said, you have the whole reciting something in front of a mirror, which people, you got to stop doing that, okay? This is just don't do it. Listen to Ness Williams. She's immortal. She knows things. Don't say it. But it's just such a great movie and such a great character, and he's so iconic. And like you said, such a great performance from Tony Todd, one of the best performances of modern horror, and just such a great character. So I like that he was your number 3, because obviously that moves into my number 2 with Candyman.
Nicely, yeah. We both feel very strongly about the character and that original film, so it makes sense that he's so high. My number 2, going back to another older character, another classic in my opinion. My number 2 is Norman Bates. I think the classic sort of nerdy recluse, this sort of, I think, depiction of someone being overwhelmed by his anxieties, being overwhelmed by a troubled childhood and the way his mother treated him, and I think maybe not having a father figure. So I think on many levels it makes him, again, obviously in a different way to Candyman, but maybe a more humanistic sort of horror villain. And I think obviously he's one of those villains where part of the appeal is the fact that if you pass this guy on the street, you would never think then he's a threat. You would never think then he's a maniac, he's a killer. You would just pass him on the street
And
because
just think he's an average guy.
yeah, he looks like an average guy, and that's obviously why Anthony Perkins was great casting in that.
Yeah.
He's so good at convincing as both sides of the character. Obviously, Psycho is one of the greatest horror movies ever, one of the most influential, so far ahead of its time. And I think Norman Bates and Anthony Perkins in that role does so many different things. There's certain moments where he's quite quirky, and there's little moments of humour that sort of sneaks in. There's obviously moments where he's a lot more sort of twisted and disturbed. And I think it's just one of the best depictions of like a blue collar sort of character where things from your childhood has sort of affected you in such a way then they manifest in such a disturbing way later. Then this guy clearly hasn't got the help that he's needed, and it's almost like just the setting of the Bates Motel, which is talking about spooky settings. That's one of the most iconic settings. But
just don't stay at the hotel.
Yeah, really don't. But it's this idea of he's been cooped up in that hotel so many years and has so many traumatized memories.
I completely understand why he would make it into the list. The switch between the mild-mannered, Norman Bates. I always just think of that Kubrick stare that he has right at the end of the film where he's looking like straight into the camera. And you're just like, how did someone who is so mild and comes across as so harmless manage to switch to that, to be like utterly terrifying? And like you said, if you walked past him on the street, you would never notice. He's just like your average guy. And I think that's what makes him so terrifying, is he literally could be anyone any mild-mannered desk clerk that you come across. He's so iconic when you think about it. You think about horror movie villains, you think about classic horror movies, of course you're going to think about Psycho, and you're going to think about Norman Bates, which the name itself just is synonymous with horror now. So definitely, that's a good choice. Well, we've arrived at number one. Now, I don't think my number one is going to surprise anyone, especially anyone who's been watching our recent reviews, because of course my absolute favorite horror villain of all time is the Shape himself, the boogeyman, Michael Myers. No other horror movie villain has scared the pants off me like Michael Myers. The first time I saw Halloween, I could not sleep because that freaking Shape just haunted my nightmares. As I've talked about in all of our reviews, if a Halloween movie has a good Michael, I am sold. Something about the silent killing of Michael, the stalking, the way he's always there in the shadows, watching, waiting. You don't know if he's real or not. You don't know if he's supernatural or not. You don't know where he is. So for me, this is Michael Myers from 1978 and from 2018. They are the two best Michaels for me. And just the presence that he has and the terror. Obviously, anyone who's been watching our Halloween reviews has seen me smile when I talk about Michael Myers. You might be getting a little bit worried. I was saying to Stephen just the other day, I was like, I might like Michael Myers too much. We might have to do something about that. Just this could be worrying. Should not have such a lady boner for Michael Myers, but I can't help myself. He's just so terrifying and so effective. I love that he doesn't speak. I love that he doesn't really have a motivation, which is why I love that they took out the familial bond between him and Laurie, because for me, he works so much better when he is just a killing machine with no reason. And the mask, of course, I've spoken about the mask before, but Michael Myers, his design, I find terrifying. When the mask is good and you can't see his eyes and he's just that soulless killing machine coming for you, it's like, he terrifies me and he awes me at the same time. So I watch it and I feel really scared, but I also feel really excited. I love watching him kill more than I love watching any other horror movie villain kill. His kills are always so effective. For me, Michael Myers, I don't think there's much more I can say about him other than what I've already said in our Halloween reviews. And like I said, anyone who's been watching us, I don't think they're going to be surprised by this at all. But that is my number one, is Michael Myers.
So having said that, there's no suspense really, because you would have noticed that so far he hasn't appeared on my list, and it's pretty obvious if you're doing a top 10 somewhere along the line Michael Myers is going to appear, and he hasn't so far, so he is my number one as well. So
Nice.
that works out perfectly. It's so beautiful because we've been doing the franchise recently, and then we've got this aim, and I can't really say anything else. I mean, obviously, again, Nick Castle is just brilliant. He is the definitive Michael Myers. He embodies him, the physicality. Again, I think in those early movies, obviously the first one being the prime example, Carpenter brilliantly does that classic horror thing of slowly unveiling the monster. So when he's finally revealed and you get the scene at the end of the film where his mask comes off, it's a real sort of moment. I think that's one of the things in classic horror where those moments have to land. If those moments don't land, then it takes away from a lot of the effect of the film. So when you see his face for the first time in that Halloween in the first film, it's a great scene. It's a great unveiling, because it's like for the first time you're seeing this guy, the human face behind this monster. He's an absolute machine. He's animalistic. Great physical performance. There's a mystique to him. And obviously we can debate, which we have done, the different depictions, how silly at times it's gotten with him. But there's also this side to him where he may or may not be supernatural. And that's another appeal to the character. It adds another layer of mystique where he is such a force, and the way he can just sit up like it's nothing after he appears to have been put down for good. I think, yeah, you could read it as he is supernatural. Certainly you can say he's got the strength, more strength than your average person, and can take so much more. He's got a great presence. Castle plays him so well, and I think all the ingredients are there, because even if you don't have Castle, as long as you've got someone with a decent presence and the physicality, the movement, and you've got the right director and the right script, I think even today people say we're so many years on now, but that concept is one of the greatest horror concepts, just this maniac on the loose, tracking people down, a cat and mouse type game. I think it's a timeless classic that we've even seen in other genres. I think a film like Terminator, there's a lot of stuff going on like that in the Terminator. I just think of that scene of him going through the police station. I mean, that almost feels like a very Michael Myers type scene. So I love the fact that you can apply it to other genres like that. And I think that's part of our problem with some of the sequels, and they overcomplicate the premise. You don't have to do that. The premise is there. If you get a good Michael, you get good protagonists, which obviously Laurie was in the original, and you make it really tense and atmospheric.
That is very cool. I am actually really not surprised, but I wasn't expecting us to both have Michael Myers as number one. So I'm actually really happy that lined up. That is a very cool way to end this top 10. So we had a few that crossed over, and we each had a few that were surprises. Still, we're going to have to revisit Leprechaun so I can see if your claim is valid. But aside from that, I think that is actually very cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed that top 10. I actually really enjoyed going through that. That was a lot of fun.
That was a great one. I mean, obviously, villains are such a core part of horror. You know, horror films wouldn't be the same without them, no matter how disturbing they are, the dark places they go to. But it's a fun one to kick off our top 10 lists. We're definitely going to do more. We're going to alternate between film and TV because we're big TV fans as well. So I think for next month we might do a TV one. But as I said at the start of the video, let us know if there's any lists you want us to do. Suggest a list, and we can't guarantee we'll do it, but if you do suggest one, we'll do our best.
We'll do our best.
At least have a think about it. But suggest your lists, and also let us know what your top 10 would be in the comments below. Like and subscribe as always. Share us out on social media. We're doing extra episodes during this spooky season of October. Obviously, Ghostface was mentioned there on Rachel's list. That's a good link because we will be doing the Scream franchise. Now that we've done Halloween as a franchise, we'll be kicking off Scream at the end of this month. So before we go, Rachel, do you just want to promote your channel?
Yeah, guys, come follow me, Rachel Macdonald. I've been a little quiet recently. Some of you might have known because I mentioned it. We've been in lockdown here. I do still work, but it's been crazy. I have a Candyman script in the works. I mentioned it in our Candyman review, where I will be looking at how Nia DaCosta kind of reclaims the movie from the white filmmakers who made it the first time. Keith and I will be doing a ranking video of the Halloween films, which will be up on my channel. I will have that up hopefully in time for Halloween, so look out for that one. And just follow me for other essay-based content. I do some horror stuff, but I also cover a wide variety of TV shows and movies. So come follow me, Rachel Macdonald, and you can find links to both my Twitter and my Tumblr on my YouTube account as well. So follow me everywhere.
Okay, that's great stuff. So take care, guys. I hope you're enjoying October, and you'll certainly see more of us before the month's out, and more top 10 lists to come on the channel. So take care. See you guys later.